The connection seems to be pretty good, so I'm jumping on right online now. We'll find out how long the signal goes. It's up to the gods. Everybody can see our patrons. Thank you, everybody. I won't bother reading through all of that. Everybody who has been sticking things out all this up and down time. Away we go. We'll clarify that. I've sent off a letter to link to Jackson if he's able to come in at any point along the game. Links are all prepped up to be able to stick in, and I've got the last week's episode running. We're continuing replacing Darwin chapter 8. He's still in technical citation wheel spinning mode, where he's trying to defend the superstructure of an argument that never can fly, which is that the genetic high slave genetic mutation rates are never going to fit his model, but he tries to cite material on it. So I've got a whole slew of material that popped up, but not quite. He cited an old 2005 paper by Ho and Company on time dependency of mutation rates, which explicitly sought to improve the measure of how you could determine what divergence rates were and how fast mutation rates were actually going by looking at both human beings and Neanderthals. And it looks like species aren't all on a fixed ratio, that different organisms have somewhat different rates, which can affect how you calibrate all of this stuff. Not nearly enough calibration change to salvage 1,000-year time frame. Nonetheless, science field. And I really wonder why he was citing a 2005 work when it's 2017 when he was writing, and also what happened after that. And it turned out not a huge amount of pushback on Ho's hypothesis. There's one that popped up, though, fairly recently in 2015. And there was a little bit of an exchange going between Ho on this material. There's also quite a lot of work independent of that group, including a 2020 paper in Nature that relates to population size and other facts by the rates deduced could lead to divergence times after seeming physical things. So, for example, we are seeing human fossils going back 3,000 years, but the divergence rate seems somewhat more recent. And it turns out it has to do with what population size you've got, that can greatly affect what you see in the genes you get from an existing organism. That's why you have to look not only at current organisms, but also the previous fossil examples. And we've got all that Neanderthal DNA that we could look at. Jeanson doesn't discuss any of that material, nor does he offer any really cogent alternative to all of that. So I'll be putting up the link to relates to doing a piece from 2012 that got re-annexed by Sam I at 2022. Our shrinking brains, which is all about the issue about whether or not human beings' brain size has actually kind of declined a little in the past few thousand years, and if so, why? And that turns out to relate to a new paper that addresses that very topic in which suggests I'll be putting them to Silva, that suggests is due to the human's reliance on external information storage, but isn't really as spectacular as you would think. Notice, it looks like we're starting to have signal eccentricities. You can see this and you'll be able to download the paper, how big of a swath you've got over in here. So what you're looking like is a tiny shift in averages, not a really noticeable alteration in the whole range of human brains runs from what's smaller to bigger. So none of that is really going to be helping any of the creationist arguments, and it'll be stuff that'll naturally want to be brought up in Rocks Were There Volume 2 when we have the section on the human evolution part, of which, boy, busy little beaver on Tales of the Big Slosh. I'm just now coordinating material on the evolution of creationists on carnivory. As you may know from the creationist lore, their view is that tooth and claw eating only came after the fall of Adam. But it was not entirely obvious when after, because that's from Adam all the way down to what? Noah and company. And for an awful long time, the trope has been, and still is among grassroots creationists, that fall. And Ken Ham reflects that, and you see in a lot of their apologetics, it wasn't a drum that was beaten a lot by Henry Morris and Duane Gish in a lot of their upper level apologetics. So it's basically the thing that was being told kind of in the church level and the sidebars and publications. So yes, I can't wait for the Rocks Were There Volume 2. Tell everybody you know about Rocks Were There Volume 1, bang, 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 and for that matter, the Evolution Slam Dunk companion work. Yeah, we're very, very proud of all of this stuff. Jackson and I have been enjoying the heck out of writing all of this stuff, and I'm enjoying the heck out of doing my contribution to it, which is the cosmology stuff and particularly the flood legends. And there'll be a lot of sidebars on geology and that he'll be bringing up. And I've got a mass of side technical literature, which Colton and others have actually physically arranged all around in my basement, sorted out, preparing for inclusion into the book, probably about the same level of material. But anyway, on that carnivory issue, there's evolution or a weakening of the position to going back to the fact that the fossils are clearly showing critters eating critters in the fossil record, which means that carnivory exists before the flood. And so the doctrinal position that's starting to seep in just by not mentioning it so much is to acknowledge that there were carnivorous dinosaurs and all the rest. In fact, they highlighted in the lower editions of the Answers in Genesis books. So maybe Ken Ham hasn't really much attention to his own apologetics on this. There will be some really Looney Tunes sidebars along the way in relation to novels that have been done on Noah's Ark lore and all of the notions about the ones still defending the non-carnivorous dinosaur models. And I would suggest that in future, it's probably the case that if somebody is an old fart at my level, odds are that they'll be following the older tradition, the 1960s, 70s creationism of carnivory after the flood. Whereas if they're in the younger set that are drawing more and more on the online material, and particularly YouTubes and that sort of thing, the odds are that they will be more open to the idea of carnivorous critters in the past and accept it as after the fall of Adam, somewhere along the line. And let's not be too detailed about it. All of that, what's going to be really funky in the new book on the discussion of the flood lore and the various cultures that existed and how far back they did and when they were domesticating crops and animals and what their cultures were doing along, and is there any sign that they were engaged in terrifying evil and wickedness, which is the whole justification in the Noah's Ark story in Genesis for the flood having happened. Yeah, boy, that's looking problematic. And there'll be an up-to-date compendium of the genetic material, the paleontology, the archaeology. There's so much marvelous stuff that's been going on, and so much about the actual migrations of peoples around the earth that really has only been clarified in the last 5 or 10 years. So there are people, there's one fascinating one, I think they're like the Zemanyaya or something like that. I'm trying to remember from memory their name, but genetic signatures are popping up all over the place, and we're starting to get a connection issues problem here. We're still running, so I'm hoping I'm not roboting or having on that front. But the signatures of these people go back 5,000 to 8,000 years. They're showing up in the genetics of and burial data from all over Eurasia. But the people that are almost extinct, and there's a little bit of population of them separating out in the steppes of Eurasia that have survived to this day, even though their genetic admixture with peoples in the past of showing that there was an awful lot going on in the past is only available in the archaeological data. You find that none of this should come as a surprise to anybody familiar with the history of human beings. It's really hard to cram into the flood model, where all of this archaeology stuff has to functionally be occurring after 4300 BCE, when the 2350 BCE, when the flood is taking place. And that's a tough haul to deal with. There's just too much material to try to coordinate around, but it's forming a fascinating story. We've got, even within relatively recent times, we know peoples get around. The modern Turks in Turkey didn't used to live in Turkey. They lived way to the east in the steppes and got thrown off and started migrating westward centuries, in part because of climate shifts due to some volcanic eruptions and all of that, long before they ever actually start bumping into the place where they actually settle down. And we know other peoples, Celts and Germans, and that have wandered all over the place in various times. And this is turning out to be largely the case for just about everybody everywhere. But it's taking place in slow motion over a long period of time. They've been piecing together now the multiple migration routes that are going on in East Asia, pulses 50,000 years ago and 8,000 years ago, and others that they can trace in the genetics of living people, and also the fossil data that they can acquire. Because when you get down into the range where you're only about 15, 20,000 years or less, you're getting increasingly good DNA data. And you can probably guess how little of this information gets discussed in the creationist literature. In fact, every so often when I'm looking up a lot of the technical papers, I'll kind of post, has anybody mentioned this in the creationist literature? So it's all part of the difficulties of it. The deeper time material about the out of Africa that's taking place in pulses, it looks like, hundreds of thousands of years ago, and this in part depends on what sea levels were during ice age eclipse and what kind of climate shifts and things were going on. That stuff will be more in the human evolution chapter, when we're pulling together all the stuff on the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, and then of course farther back with the Homo erectus, the first big wanderlust group that spreads all over the place, and all of that. And so there's such a huge array of data. This is now when we're dealing with the context of when fire usage was appearing in human beings, when art was starting to develop, and that too is turning to be much more complex. Independent groups are figuring out how to make symbolic stuff. They're using shells for ornaments. They're using ochre for paint decorations on their bodies, or and you can find that in their burials, and the like. And this is happening, and doing cave art and other things. And this is happening in various spots around the world, not apparently part of some grand cultural diffusion where one group is coming up with the smart thing. Other people are coming up with it too. And so the picture is just deliciously rich, and getting richer. And none of this is fitting into the creationist model, to where they've got to yank time frames down. Joel Duff just did a brand new video on Nathaniel Jeanson being interviewed. It's actually from 2020, the Jeanson video, but it's part of a series that Jeanson did with Ken Ham, and we'll be alluding to various aspects of this because it concerns the peopling of Americas and Jenson's arguments trying to cram everything into their chronology. But he's apparently come up with a conversion chart, and we'll be linking in the new book to this Duff video, where he goes in to analyze the problem of it. But all you have to do is to envisage a chronology chart and a kind of a funnel that shunts down towards the modern period. And so the idea is this becomes like a conversion funnel, where the farther back you go, the more conversion you have to do. So when you get to around 1900 BC, when they're getting closer and closer to the supposed flood date, the funnel just goes straight up. So functionally, every radiocarbon date that gets dumped into the funnel will get shunted down to be post-flood at some point or another. The problem is trying to cram all of that stuff together. You have the physical distance to cover. It's a little ways to get from Ararat to Terra del Fuego. And regardless whether you're paddling in some boats every once in a while or doing it all on foot, you've got all of that you need to account for. And it's going to be hilarious to see what young Earth creationists are trying to do on this subject over the next decades. The new crop of people, you've got the Paleo young Earth creationist who's a young kid, and boy, he's all full of pea and vinegar. Erica has interviewed him. He accepts that Lucy was in fact bipedal and criticizes all the calculus of the flood limits their model. Yeah, and we are going to be discussing every parameter that we possibly can. Not only for the physical flood, the forensics of deposits and how quickly they can form, the difficulty of animal distribution, cultural information on the line, the various legends. I finished the big section. It's become an appendix to the new book because it got so big, it was too big really to put in as an info box. It was going to spread across probably 4 or 5 pages. On various claims about flood legends. It's not even a comprehensive list because there's lots and lots and lots of flood legends around the world, but they cluster into a variety of types. And what we're going to be covering will be the kind of greatest hits, highlights that illustrate their problems. That the fact that it's a recurring feature of young Earth creationism that they just cannot stand the idea that some local people's flood legends that sound an awful lot like Noah's Ark were got from missionaries. And ironically, we've got more than enough circumstantial evidence on a lot of differences in addition to the flood, where missionaries have been banging away for centuries in some cases, that it would be astonishing if some of these things didn't interfere with the tales. Some of them, like the Miao, M-I-A-O, put that in there, they're trying a little subculture in that does have some with the mainland culture, and don't sound much like Noah, except from one that the Reverend Truax was putting out in 1950 and then again in 1991, and that one sounds really flood, and it's only known from Truax's version. No one can find any corroboration for it whatsoever, so it's highly suspicious. There's another thing that just popped up just this last week that I've been putting into this very example about how cultural things can shift, and it has to do with mermaids. Involves and they look at things, and they sometimes would make up of them with splicing animals together and all of that, and they're nasty, they're harbin doom, they're not pleasant little to deal with until World War I period, when the Japanese found the first translations of Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid, and within a short period of time, the human-sized, benign, beautiful enchantress mermaid took over and has reformatted all of those lore. And so now the mermaid lore in Japan is in that Hans Christian Andersen mode, not in the old traditional Japanese one. And they've literally traced exactly when that was taking place in the period within the 20th century. So it would just be gobsmacking. The Mao involves what? The Mao tale has supposedly a nice guy, in fact, called Nuah, N-U-A-H, I think is how he spells it, who takes his family on an ark, and they survive the flood, and they send a dove out afterwards. It's all very, very, very flood-like. But the actual Mao stories that there's a huge lore on now, and I was able to get bunch of different independent works on this, in addition to the little bit of postings and stuff that have been gone on Talk Origins years ago, but I've versions of it. They're all very different stories. They involve having a brother and sister have sex after a big inundation, and they make a kind of weird blob-like homunculus creature that then splits into multiple ones that become the various neighbors that they know. So it's partly an origin story for the people that are living there, and also the origins of languages and that sort of a thing. But all of the normal feature about animals being taken on the ark and all of that, and of course the dove reference, that's another fun one to see how creation is like to latch on to the dove and the raven issues. And once in a while you can find legends that mention those birds because they exist, but often they don't. They're very odd contexts, and the odds are they're an isolated instance of a flood of these elements, and there have been missionaries running around there. The odds are, Italiano wrote a book quite a long time ago on legend lores, and she had noticed this connection as well between work and the impact that it has on cultures. Now, this, again, with the mermaid, we can assume that this sort of stuff has been going on in a lot of different contexts. The funky fun part about some of the tales, like New Guinea and Australia, is that there's a good evidence that the flood tales they actually have, which involve waters suddenly coming up and people climbing trees to get away from them, makes sense with tsunamis from volcanic eruptions and plate slippages. And also in Australia, you've got the Aborigines have been around long enough to notice the sea level rising after the glacial period ended. And so some of their legends relate to that. They say, you know, that island out there, we used to be able to walk across to that. Well, back when the Ice Age sea levels were lower, yeah, you could. And so that there's actually a lot of different lore. It doesn't mean that you have to reject everything that was said in the past, quite to the contrary. But the absolute passion that creationists have to ramrod everything into their narrow lore to make sure it's just the flood story, and that any deviations from the flood story are due to their distance from Ararat and their distance from the true version that's in Genesis. You even get that kind of an argument. Will also, it comes up in relation to the story in Egypt. What tales that do pop up in there have been wrangled around by various years. That's part of a collection of material. And once in a while, we'll be alluding to topics that were brought up in Volume 1. In Volume 1, we're also having additional material because some of the same dramatis personae do pop up in there. Some of the same topics kind of come up again because the stuff on genetic mutation rates that we were alluding to in Volume 1 comes in with a vengeance in relation to Jeanson's creationist arguments recent human beings are, and how that he's thinking that the Native Americans are arriving in the New World like in the post-Christian times. He's got a Delaware tribe coming in 280 AD and all that. Now, it doesn't mean that the tribes aren't moving around a bit. You have with the Anasazi people that are very mysterious, leading to Hopi and Navajo and others in the area, in the Four Corners area in the Southwest. Unless you have burials, because so many of the cultures didn't bury their dead, they just let them out for the animals to recycle. So you have a sparse data field when it comes to some of the genetics. You can do some of the things in trying to date and coordinate the various cultural shifts, but the lack of a written tradition and the lack of a lot of the burial information means that you don't have some of the things that you can do with the burial intensive cultures that bury their people in mounds and that in the megalithic cultures in Europe and in other spots, and megalomaniac Chinese emperors, that would bury them, as well as the bodies that would get stuck in monuments, when they were running out of workforce and just simply turn them into fill. That happened in part with the building of the Great Wall. Gruesome stuff. So there's an awful lot of stuff that is going to be coming along the scene, and will be updating as much as possible to make it as contemporary as possible and not have to simply sound like I'm recycling Talk Origins posts, from 2007. We move beyond that. We can find out more. So we'll have lots on the biology and the genetics and the archaeology lore and the various cultural traits and all of that. There's so much exciting technical work out there that I'm like a kid in a candy store. It's exhausting at times on the thing because there is so much involved on it, and also keeping up with the incoming material, which in the next few weeks, having a good connection will help. Hi, Brave Mug. How are you doing? Here's our insect guy. Yes, there's alas and alack, there's not a huge amount of bugs showing up yet in Volume 2. We did have stuff on the little bug carcasses in Rocks 1 in relation to Green River deposit, but we will be getting back to some arthropods and that, although I think we're referencing you a bit in relation to that nutball that was talking about the giant cockroaches, because there's that weird tradition in the bottom feeder creationist cryptozoology crowd that wants to believe in oh, you got a snake in the basement last night? Wow. Whatever was Ted Cruz doing in your basement? Wow. Anyway, sorry for the cheap joke. I could, listening to the hearings, it just comes up. Yeah, that's that presumably means that you have like an access route through like a hole or something. But the only thing I get occasionally in the basement are once in a while, there's a few little spots where I'm worried that the ants might try to come in. There's a big ant colony that lives under the lawn. And the spiders have their little spot down by the staircase, and there's a tiny little crack in the foundation that I think is up there. And I have to watch out not to overwater certain areas around the roses outside, lest some of that water can kind of leak in. So I know there's a little bit of a crack in that little zone, but nothing serious, and certainly no reptiles have invaded my space. So I am more than not envious of you on that front. There will be some material on the paleontology and on all of that stuff when I can see Jackson's chapters that relate to the paleo worlds, because we're going to be talking about the whole shift in the Rhodinian world and the development of the Precambrian leading into the Cambrian period, and then of course the supercontinents, and then you start having critters up on the land. So all of that geology, yes, the giant cockroach that wasn't, yes. Another one that pops up in the creationist lore are the ones that try to think, what are they, isopods or whatever? They're little bug that to idiot creationists, they like to think that these are living trilobites, and you get a little bit of that popping up on there. But an awful lot of the material will be relating to the cryptozoology lore that connects up to the ones that want to have living pterosaurs and living plesiosaurs and dinosaurs traipsing around in Angkor Wat stegosaurs and all of that. It's a lore that never quite goes away. There's always Kent Hovind out there to repeat a lot of this stuff. And it will be pulled together as to the latest material. Surprisingly enough, there's for those of you who are aware of the Japanese plesiosaur claim, that's a Japanese trawler supposedly picked up a plesiosaur back in the 1970s, and it still pops around in the creationist cryptozoology lore at the same time that the mainstream creationists at Journal of Creation have been dumping on it for years. And I think Todd Wood and others are also saying, yeah, no. So that is yet another measure of things where there are tropes that have become fossilized in certain segments of the creationist lore. Yeah, the pill bugs, roly-polies, there we go. They look like trilobites, so they must be the same, except, of course, if you look closely, and at which point suddenly they don't look nearly at all. Oh, wow. Kent claims to have the fossil of an 18-inch cockroach. Isn't that wonderful? Yes, well, maybe it's like those clams. We'll be mentioning the clam matter because Kent Hovind is one of the ones who keeps on repeating the bloody story that there are the open versus closed clams and the stuff up on Mount Everest trope that's been running through there. It's largely channeled from Walt Brown, and it still appears in his apologetics to this very day. Unfortunately, they're not clams, they're brachiopods, and brachiopods are very different in the way their shells move than all that musculature and all of that. But who's ever going to accuse Kent Hovind of studying a subject? Anyway, oh, my. Well, I must say we've had a pretty nice connection going on here. We managed to go 30 minutes. Yay! I'll be sticking, of course, all the linkages into the piece. Anybody's gotten any questions or comments or things on the thing? As usual, there will be the convenient book club links. So anybody that wants to glom onto the books can do so in your own networks. Tell everybody about it, and you can say, hey, you can check out RJ's videos, and there will be always the link to the works. And once we get the next one on the line, which cross fingers will be later in the year, we'll have yet another work on the field that will finish off Answers in Genesis. We will have covered enough stuff with the human evolution material and the cosmology section and the culture camp diatribes on Darwinian racism and the origins of Tiktaalik and tetrapods and the paleogeography issues, and so much on the geology. The Grand Canyon will be dealt with in even more detail in terms of its geology. That between the two volumes, we'll have covered all of the matters that we intended to deal with. There will be a big section on soft tissues where we'll be pulling that up to speed and all the ups and downs and ins and outs of all of that. We'll be alluding to Armitage's Triceratops horn, which is probably a fairly recent bison horn, not a Triceratops at all. And all of that stuff in there. So it will be a one-stop compendium with allusions back to the previous book. I got a novel too, remember? Phileas Fogg. I'm on chapter 34 of that. I'm just finishing up my big fight scene, sword fight and all the rest aboard the mysterious airship Helios and all that, and still got just a couple chapters left to go. I know where the plot's going, but it's got to be buffed properly, and I've got a juggling act of things all happening in very, very short succession and timing backwards to make sure I can figure out that all the pieces fit together properly. But anyway, that keeps the other half of my brain busy. So that kind of covers it up. We're about 30 minutes in. Probably didn't see any sign that Jackson's here. Will there be some more amount about De Young in part 2? De Young, the astronomer guy, that will relate. He's a relatively minor character, oddly enough, in modern day creationist cosmology. You've got Jeanson Wieland and a few others that are really kind of the point men on the matter, because they have to deal with the relativity theory and the speed of light issue and all of that. If we're talking Donald DeYoung, he's from the 1980s era of old style creationism, and I think he still pops up writing material every now and then, but he's not really in the cutting edge of things. Just in the same way that so many of the ticking time bomb issues in creationism about speciation rates and the origin of species within created kinds have really begun to be addressed by this new generation of they're just as ideological as their old counterpart, but they are trying to kind of grapple with some of these things. To see how long they're going to be able to keep it up is another matter, because the data is never going to fit. So it's a matter of ad hoc rescue mechanisms, here that's standing for truth, or simply ignoring problems. And just as the creationist geologists have no impact in regulology, creationist cosmologists have had no impact outside of their field. They haven't even garnered the interest of Big Bang deniers, because there's a small body of astrophysicists who have never liked the Big Bang. They're kind of the descendants of Fred Hoyle and the bunch. But they don't really canoodle much with the young Earth creationists on this point, even though you would think they would have an opportunity to do that. So I think then we've got a good show. We've got all the material in. Once the thing's finalized, of course, I'll be sticking all the links in, and thank the wiki Wi-Fi gods of having a connection that stayed pretty damn good all the way through. Everybody stay safe. Watch for the troubles in Ukraine and hope that can be dampened down. We don't know what the heck is going to happen in there. I don't want this to be our equivalent of 1939. We've been through that. We don't want to do that again. So everybody stay safe, hunker down, watch out for concerns. We're loosening up a lot of masks in Washington State. We've moved past that, although everyone's keeping their fingers crossed in relation to the latest versions of Omicron and all that are knocking around in Europe and that. So keep your mask handy just in case. If you haven't been vaccinated, get vaccinated. If you haven't gotten the boost, get boosted, and be prepared to behave reasonably and intelligibly, even if the nutballs refuse to. So everybody stay safe, and catch you all next week. And don't accept any wooden penguins.